there's a lot of really good environmental activity going on in the Boston, Massachusetts area, covering a huge spectrum, from recycling to very science-dense kinds of involvements. It's a big spectrum. People are finding their way into it. And these two groups are important in that because they do represent very different parts of the spectrum. And the fact that they are one very focused on lowering emissions, and the legislation and the organization that helps further that, associated with the 350.org, which is probably the largest environmental movement in the world at this point. And Biodiversity for Livable Planet, which is focused on a different part of the spectrum, which recognizes the amount of carbon dioxide in the air, but which is focused on the biodiversity that is suffering because of it, and what can be done to reclaim the planet now as part of the plan for the future. So they cover a wide area. They overlap. And it's I want to just put that thought in your head that as you see this very different kind of show, which is part personal story and partly an examination of a serious problem, partly about science and fuel, and partly about what it means to be an artist in a world that is in serious crisis. So there's a lot here to chew on and a lot to hear, and we welcome you to be part of the conversation, quite open at the end. We're going to have representatives of both the groups here as responding, and it's going to be a large get-together here at the end. The show's about 75 minutes in all.
For most of my life, if somebody asked me where I was from, I didn't have an easy answer. The Fort McMurray wasn't on the map. I mean, it was too far north. Even when I was a kid, they had those pull-down maps on the classroom wall. They'd cut off right above Edmonton. Like there was nothing or nobody up there. It was oil that put Fort McMurray on the map. In 1967, the Great Canadian Oil Sands Company opened the world's first oil mine just north of town. And I was born 3 years later, and that makes me about the same age as industry. So in my lifetime, it's grown from an obscure outpost of experimental engineering into the largest and most destructive industrial project in human history. When I was 14 years old, I decided I would become a professional musician because music had nothing to do with oil. And the morning after my last day of high school, I moved to New York. And if this were a movie, this is where it would end. But now, it's April 2015, it's nearly 30 years later, and this is my life. I live in New York. I'm a musician. I'm a college professor, and I'm sitting on stage as an invited panelist at a panel discussion on the arts plus climate change at the New School in New York City. Now there's 4 of us seated on these low, modern-looking chairs in this sleek blonde wood auditorium, massive projection screen behind us. And my fellow panelists, I mean, everyone's impeccable. Their projects, their haircuts. data on climate change. And this is not my world. I mean, on stage, I might look the part. I look like an artist, and I'm wearing all black. But inside, I know I'm just kind of passing. Like a few days before the panel, we had a conference call to prep for it, and I had to ask the dean of the Tar Sands School of Design what design is. And just as he was giving me the answer, I got rear-ended on Route 17 in Paramus, so I never found out. So someone starts talking on stage about the Keystone XL pipeline. Now, it was all over the news back then. The pipeline protest movement was about to become the next big thing. And my fellow panelists were expert commentators. They lean back, they cross their legs, they show off their perfect sneakers, and sitting comfortably at a distance, talk about the great art they're going to make about someone else, somewhere else, getting completely fucked. Now, someone says tar sands, and someone else says ground zero for climate change, and I can tell they've seen the pictures, right? I mean, the toxic tailings ponds, the oil-soaked ducks, the earth skinned alive. But I'm probably the only person in the room who could find the place on the map, right? Because they don't know it. But they're talking about Fort McMurray, the place where I was born. They don't know it, but they're talking about my life. And I'm pinned to the stage, and something starts to shatter inside me. Now, I don't want to sell myself short. Like, on the outside, I'm saying all the right things. I'm nodding my head. I'm making thoughtful remarks. But on the inside, I'm realizing that I have spent 30 years trying to keep these two places, these two parts of my life apart. Oil and music. Alberta and New York. And now the tectonic plates of my life are colliding inside me, on stage, on live stream. Really, you can look it up. So I can't just sit there while people are talking about the end of the world as it's playing out in the place where I was born. So that's when I hear myself saying, I was born in Fort McMurray. I became a musician because it had nothing to do with oil. And I could feel it, right? The room woke up. I felt this power. I had this authority. And just as quickly, I felt ashamed for reducing this complicated place, my family, this wound, into a perfect soundbite. Now, Fort McMurray is where I was born. It's where my dad's Esso station was. My stepfather was an engineer for Suncor, GCOS. It's where my stepbrother Philip died. And it's where my mother heard a symphony orchestra for the first time. It's not like the world needs another panel discussion. So I had to go home.
We were looking at a fresh start, and the company, Great Canadian Oil Sands, was making some pretty good offers to young people. In fact, I think that we had an
an interest-free mortgage. My dad was, shall we say, often absent. As one of my mother's old friends told me, well, maybe it's different in this day and age, but back then, women couldn't be smarter than men. Dad didn't like working for industry. He wanted to be an entrepreneur, so he opened an Esso station. Now, Ernest was there too. He was courtly. He was Russian, one of the engineers who come in from all over the world to work on a big project. 1970, I'm born. My dad shows up for this birth. 1973, we moved to Edmonton. My dad opens another Esso station. We live in a neighborhood called Petrolia. Our local hero is Wayne Gretzky of the Edmonton Oilers. The McDonald's had a pump jack in the playground. And on the southern edge of the city, the Leduc #1 oil derrick stands on guard. As a child, it is my Eiffel Tower. 1977. My parents get divorced. Ernest gets divorced too, and he gets transferred to Edmonton, and we visit his bachelor apartment with its Danish swivel chairs and low teak tables. My mom is working 2 jobs. She's back in university. Ernest courts her. He grooms her. He marries her, and they hold their reception at the Petroleum Club. 1981. Ernest, now my stepfather, is transferred to Calgary. We move to a house in a new subdivision called Ranchlands. He sits in the front room with his Danish swivel chairs and his low teak tables, smoking his pipes and listening to his classical music LPs. He puts framed color photographs on the wall, upgraders, compressors, their curved pipes gleaming at sunset, smokestacks and gas flares like beacons. And on the stereo console, there's an executive set of 5 glass jars containing bitumen, tailing sand, petcoke, sulfur, and crude. We don't talk about oil because it's normal. So now, it's July 2016. It's a year after the panel discussion, and I get a research grant to go home. I'm driving into Fort McMurray, going north on Highway 63, and it's pouring rain. And I'm with my new friend Sheldon. He's offered to take me up to see the mining sites, but before we go, he says we gotta make a couple of pit stops. Oh, if we're going out to the sites, we gotta get Tim Hortons and a pack of smokes. You're gonna need a donut and a coffee and a smoke if you're gonna see that shit. Fucking go time, bro! So, he's very enthusiastic. So we hit the 7-Eleven, and we hit the Tim's drive-thru, and then we're crossing the Athabasca River, sipping double-doubles, eating honey crullers, and blowing smoke out of the windows of the rental car. Now here's what I see out the window. So on the right, coming out of town, you see low office buildings for industry service companies. Then there's heavy equipment yards. Then little strips of trees on either side of the road so you can't really see what's going on. There's a logging yard, tree trunks, stacked like corpses, like a mass grave. Constant traffic. There's pickup trucks with buggy whips, gravel trucks, tankers, shift buses, gravel trucks, shift buses carrying workers in and out of the sites. And you climb this big hill, and on the far bank of the Athabasca, you can see this mining site. It looks like a distant city, like Oz. We're starting to get a little whiff of the sulfur smell, and then we round the curve, and the trees on Gateway Hill give way to the East Mine. It's like a desert of tailing sand. There's a heroic billboard that says, "Reclamation in progress." And the Syncrude plant in the distance just pumping it out 24/7. And on the right, there's a tailings pond. It's not a pond, but kind of a lake. Like a vast, flat, sad lake. Listen to this. They've got these propane cannons all the way around the perimeter. They're giving off these soft pops every few seconds. Can you hear that? They got these dummies out on platforms over the surface of the water, dressed in coveralls and hard hats, like scarecrows, or scare ducks. And you can hear it floating in, this eerie shriek. Can you hear it? It's a bird's distress call recorded on a loop. Now, the cannons and the shrieks and the dummies, they're all part of this elaborate automated system to keep birds from landing on the water, because if birds land there, they die. So this is where my stepfather went every day all those years. I never saw this. I saw the signs of it. I saw the logos on his pens. I saw the safety vest and the hard hat in his closet. He never said a word about this, but this is what he carried. So now, Sheldon and I are driving past the giants of mining exhibit. With an old bucket wheel and a drag line in a park with picnic tables, right across from the upgrader plant. So this is me and Sheldon. We're in the car.
Here, look at that huge house of shovel. That's an old wheel. I think these are the old dinosaurs that they don't use anymore. Those are examples. But you see, as a man or a woman, when you come to work and you walk up to destruction, you are absolutely, are you kidding me? You want me to drive this thing?
No, it's the coolest.
It is the absolute coolest.
It's the ultimate Tonka truck.
That's, you know what? That's exactly what the first foreman said on my first shift on the first day of the job. He said, we are so blessed. We get the biggest Tonka trucks and the biggest sandbox in the world.
A year later, Sheldon and I were still talking about it. As soon as my thing connects.
It's I don't know. It's scary. For myself, I gotta say that there's an element of shock and awe that comes with it, you know? Like, it's almost like you can't believe this is real. And then they ask you, hand you a shovel and say, you know, go do this, or, you know, give you the keys to a truck and say, go haul this. And then you're part of the machinery, right?
So, what they're mining up there is bitumen. I want you to imagine a mixture of crude oil, quartz sand, clay, and oil. Here's a little baggie of it. Get it back. So here's how they get the bitumen out of the sand. So they use these giant trucks to scrape up the vegetation and the soil. They call that the overburden. Then power shovels scoop the oil sands and load them into giant trucks, like the biggest trucks in the world. And they dump that into crushers to break it up. Then they mix that with hot water, and then they pipe the slurry to the extraction plant. Now there's a museum in Fort McMurray called the Oil Sands Discovery Center, and they do a demo of the separation process using ordinary kitchen tools. They take a 1-liter Pyrex beaker, like the one you use in a French press, but they call it a primary conditioning vessel, and they pour in boiling water from an electric kettle. They call that a kettle. They stir it with a metal spoon to condition the slurry. They hold the spoon up to show you how the quartz wears away in the steel. They skim off the froth, and then you see these 3 layers. There's bitumen at the top, the middlings, which are the leftover processed water, kind of looks like the coffee, and the tailings, which are the coffee grounds. Now they can't dump that back in the river, so they make these reinforced ponds to hold the wastewater. It's got naphthenic acid, cyanide, phenols, cadmium, chromium, copper, lead, zinc, and that's what's in the tailings ponds. It can be a little humid afterwards, but I actually scooped this out of the sand myself. So, when I went to Juilliard, I thought I had arrived in 1992. I got 2 pieces of professional advice. The first was, take care of the music, and the music will take care of you. The second was, if you can see yourself doing anything else for a living, do it. Now, I dismissed that second piece of advice as irrelevant. I'd never imagined myself doing anything but music. And I took the first piece of advice as kind of a noble contract. Music couldn't fail me. Only I could fail music. Now, when I got to Juilliard, I thought I had arrived. One of my classmates came to school in his father's Learjet. Another brought in shopping bags from Chanel that she got in her lunch break. And some kids lived in these apartments in the gleaming new high-rises that were sprouting up around Lincoln Center. I lived in the 63rd Street Y. But I belonged, right? I'd passed the gatekeepers. My talent was vetted by jury. I could not fail. And then 6 months after graduation, I quit music. I went back to Calgary. I moved back in with my mother and my stepfather. And they figured I'd had my chance, and now it was time for a more sensible plan. So I went back to school for psychology. But the point is, look, I was there in Alberta in the 90s. That unbridled development was happening all around me. But I didn't see it. Nobody talked about it. It was like a professor of mine said, when I moved to Calgary, I made it a point never to associate with people who worked for oil. Anyway, after a while, I started music again, and then I quit again, and I started and quit a few more times. I moved to New York actually 3 times in total. First at 17, then at 34, then at 39. It was kind of like my career had its own boom and bust cycles. So, welcome back to Fort McMurray. We're here now, just magically, Fort McMurray. They also some people call it Fort Mac, Fort McMoney, or as a billboard says as you're entering town, it's a vibrant, sustainable region we are proud to call home. This is a classic boomtown. Its fate rises and falls with the price of oil. Now, when I was born, the population was about 6,000 people, and oil was $21.32 a barrel. In June 2008, when crude oil peaked at $160.72 a barrel, the population was 88,000 people. And maybe another 30,000 or 40,000 fly-in, fly-out workers. The price of oil these days, in case you're interested, is somewhere around $60 a barrel. Anyway, it's changed a lot since I was born. Our house is now an empty lot with a for sale sign and trucks parked in the dirt where I used to play. But I can still see it, our house. That upright piano pushed against the wood-paneled wall. My brother and me on the couch on either side of our mother, our arms filled with black kittens. My mom pacing the floor at night. My dad out in the oil can tavern again. Now, the thing is, if you look at the town one way, you can see a mid-sized city like anywhere else in North America. There's chain stores, restaurants, Walmart, McDonald's, strip malls with yoga studios and nail salons. But if you look at it another way, you see the boomtown casino, the head shop, the money mart, the liquor stores, the signs for criminal defense attorneys, the jacked up trucks idling in the long lines at the Tim Hortons drive-thru, the Somali cab drivers smoking in the parking lot, the Confederate flag nestled among the wolf blankets for sale out of the back of the white van. Now, if you care about fossil fuels and global warming, Fort McMurray is ground zero for climate change. If you care about conservative politics, it's a secure source of ethical oil. If you're an engineer, it's the Silicon Valley of the North. If you're the mayor, it's a community where people from all over the world come in search of unparalleled economic opportunities. And if you're a celebrity like Leo DiCaprio flying in to make a statement, it's Mordor. So there's a contest over who gets to define the place. The stakes are high. People have pride. People have been promised a lot. Now, just before I went back to Fort McMurray for the first time, the Edmonton Journal did a story about me and my project. And the article got some comments. The name of the book suggests she is planning to take a dump on her hometown. When I read the lead of this article, I thought, oh no, not another misinformed Neil Young, environmental artist wannabe hit on the oil sands. You lost me when you called it tar sands. Where the hell does she live? There's no tar sands on this planet. Tar sands. Anybody using that name is a fool. So let's straighten this out. They always called it the tar sands when I was a kid. Everybody did. It was affectionate, like a nickname. And it wasn't until the 90s that government and industry got together to sort of rebrand industry. So the tar sands became the oil sands because oil sounds more neutral and scientific and natural. And it took another decade before tar to become an insult. And I didn't know any of this when I started this project, but I'm keeping the name.
for strong winds that blow along, 7 seas that run high, all those things that don't change, come what may. But our good times are all gone, and I'm bound for moving on. I'll look for you if I'm ever back this way. Think I'll go out to Alberta, weather's good there in the fall. Got some friends that I could go to working for. Still I wish you'd change your mind if I asked you one more time. But we've been through this 1,000 times or more.
So I want to introduce you to some of the people that I met when I went back, like Alice. So Alice is, Alice lives in Fort Chipewyan. You take a short flight north of Fort McMurray. It's a small community downstream from the mining operations. And downstream, in this case, is north. A lot of Americans don't really get that. And to get to Alice's house, you take the short flight north with a small plane, you fly over the mines, you watch the mines give way to muskeg and wetlands, sand dunes, ribbons of rivers. You walk east along the shore of Lake Athabasca and you find the driveway opposite the stone monument. You walk up past her garden and you find Alice sitting on her front porch in the warm afternoon sun with her dog Toby at her feet.
Well, I'm 65 years old, and industry is not 65 years old, so I saw the changes from the start. When you think back, I never thought it would be such a drastic change, and you know, they say a delta is always changing, but not to that extent that we have now. I was 13 years old when I went to Fort McMurray by boat, and we stopped at Suncor, which was called GCOS then, and they were just clearing. They were just starting to clear the land, and I remember them taking down these big, beautiful white spruce, just towers of the field, not putting them down. Did I ever think it would be like this? I didn't think that. And then everything just sort of went down. It's been going down since. We don't go out to Jackfish Lake anymore. Jackfish had everything that we needed. Sometimes when the white fish was really good, we would move to the lake and stay in a tent and just make dry fish. And evenings my dad would go hunting for moose or a bear. It was a good life, you know, it was the best. And industry will come to Chip, you know, we tell them our problems. I'm sure they've heard it over and over from every angle, every young voice to the oldest voice. And we keep saying, come with us, we'll show you. And they never come with us. They won't come up. I want to show them Jackfish Lake. We have a cemetery there. That's where I'm going to bury my husband and my son next month. On that hill where a lot of my ancestors are buried.
Now, industry has its own relationship to the land. It's like Rick George, the former CEO of Suncor, wrote in his his memoir. The most appealing feature of the oil sands is that they were there to be taken. Now, Sheldon, I'm going to play this for you. It's a little bit hard to hear, so I'm going to try to translate as we go along. So you know, you look around right now, and you just see this flat muskeg peppered with tamarack and pine. And it's what's under there. It's all of that energy. What it is that energy. This land was an organic paradise. Lush and oceanic, too. Now, I'm no geologist, you know, but what you see in this flat, black, loamy muskeg that goes on for miles and 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 miles. And underneath it all is all of that energy of the sun that was absorbed by living things. And in their death, converted, that energy remains, right? You see, when I look at this terrain, I see muskeg tea, I see blueberries, I see all these medicines that we use. I see the rat root, I see our sustenance, I see our ability as indigenous people to be able to survive for thousands of years. This landscape contains our connection to the earth, you know? But you look at it as a developer and you say, I can't build on this shit. You look at it as a pulp and paper guy, you go, there's no marketable resource here. There's nothing of any value except the death, that oil, that lies beneath. So I met Sheldon at the healing gathering for the land and water. It was my first stop on my first trip back to Alberta. It was a 3-day event on Fort McMurray First Nations territory. And I found out about it on Facebook. I called the number on the event and I ended up in this long, long phone conversation with Cleo, the organizer. And Cleo made me feel welcome. Like I needed no greater reason to come back than the fact of my birth. Now, Sheldon was up there. I saw him setting up camp like he was trying to win a contest, right? And at night, he was the guy with the guitar holding court in the big white tent. So I heard the music, and I went up to him. I said, hey, sounds like you could use a fiddle. He said, yeah, right. I had this flash of shame and anger, right? Like I'm 21 again, and another dude in a plaid shirt is trying to tell me I'm not up to his level. But I said to myself, you're 46 years old. You're a professional musician. You live in New York. Just go get the damn fiddle. This is why you brought it, right? To get to know people. So, I go back to my tent, grab the case, pick up the fiddle, sit down, and I start playing along.
I'm so far from my home, I'm cold and alone. I can't tell if my heart's still beating, but when I close my eyes, there you are, my surprise. I get joy, and joy that's fleeting. Well, here I am now, all broken.
he looks at me and he says, "Where'd you come from?" So now, when my mother married my stepfather, I thought we had arrived. Uncle Ernest was sophisticated. He was a man of the world. He taught me about food. He taught me about olives and cheeses, that there could be more than one kind of cheese. And he took me on his Saturday morning rounds in Edmonton. Now, at the Italian store, the man behind the counter handed me a slice of mortadella, those white pearls of fat glistening in the pink flesh. At the Lebanese bakery, the man handed me a pita straight from the conveyor belt, puffed up like an animal, still alive, releasing steam. I got you brothers. The youngest was Philip. He was 12 years older than us. He came from England to live with us. He took me seriously. I spent summers with my granny in Gilbert Plains, Manitoba. Now, Granny taught me how to pluck chickens after I watched her cut the chicken's head off with an axe. I learned how to make cabbage rolls, pierogies, pickles. And we'd lay those pierogies out on floured cookie sheets and cover them with white tea towels. At the end of the day, the men would come in and devour hours worth of our labor in minutes. This is simply the way that it goes. And all of this was my childhood, right? But as I got older, it was clear that there was one direction in particular in which we were headed. It was forward, it was up, and up meant upward in social class. My mother didn't put me in violin lessons because she wanted me to become a professional musician. She put me in violin lessons because she wanted me to be educated. So, when people say music, they mean many different things. 1977. I am 7 years old. I've been in violin lessons for 4 years. And I'm in Manitoba because my cousin Maureen is getting married to Jerry. And I am a flower girl. I'm wearing a yellow and white gingham dress that Uncle Ernest bought just for me. And the men in the hall smoke and tell stories. And they pour Ryan Cokes and they tap long bands of ash into these round tin ashtrays. And the women stand by these long banquet tables full of pierogies and pickles and cabbage rolls. And there's a band and a Ukrainian fiddler. And someone says to me, "Hey, go on, play the Redford Jig." But I don't know their tunes. And they don't know mine. 1982. I'm 12 years old. We're living in Calgary now, and I joined a group called the Calgary Fiddlers. We play in unison on the float for the Calgary Stampede Parade. We play on CBC television. We play in white Stetsons and black Chinese slippers and red and white gingham shirts. We play the Irish washerwoman with our violins behind our backs and between our knees. Now we play a show, and my mom and my granny are there. And my mom says Granny was in her element because she could relate to this music. But Ernest leans over to my mom and says, "Is there some reason why Tanya's doing this?" So, if you ever want to know what the difference is between a fiddle and a violin, I'll tell you. It's not the instrument. Here's the thing. It's actually not that hard to play the violin. I'll attempt to demonstrate. All you have to do is find a decent teacher and do what they tell you to do. You go home after school, you go to your room, you shut the door, you take the violin out of its case, and you do exactly what they tell you to do. You go through Suzuki Book 1, to Book 2, to Book 3, to Book 4. You go from lessons with the teacher who's closest to your house to the teacher you have to take 2 buses to get to. You go from local to provincial to national competitions and national to international festivals. I went from group lessons at age 3 to Carnegie Hall at age 16 to Juilliard at 17. Anyway, here's the thing. People assume that if you went to Juilliard, you can pretty much play anything, but it's kind of not true. Because fiddling, well, in Calgary, a fiddler is kind of an entertainer, right? But up north, a fiddler is something else, like a specialist, kind of like a heart surgeon. Before radio, before television, it was the fiddle that carried culture and community all up and down the river systems. And if a fiddler was around, people would gather from all over. On my first trip back, when people found out I had a violin, it was only a matter of time before someone would ask me, "So, can you play the Red River Jig?" I was talking to my mom about it afterwards, and she said, "Well, what do you expect, Tanya? I mean, of course you need to know how to play the Red River Jig." So, when I got back to New York, I tried to learn the tune. I downloaded a bunch of versions from iTunes. Métis fiddlers like Cap Boyer and Andy DeJarlis. And I bought a video lesson from Calvin Holrath in Edmonton. And that's where I learned that you actually have to tune the G string up a whole step. It makes a big difference. I hate tuning in public. The thing is, it's actually not that straightforward learning to play the Red River Jig. Métis fiddling is complicated. It's like generations of intercultural connections. And you can't extract culture out of a YouTube video, you know? So I watched this 1972 documentary from the National Film Board of Canada. There's a trapper, Frank Ladouceur. He's talking about how the Red River Jig traveled up the fur trade route. Up from Minnesota and North Dakota, and Manitoba, and north through Saskatchewan, and farther north, all the way up to Fort Chipewyan, where Frank's father was playing the fiddle in a cabin that's set into the snow and the night like a jewel. And everybody dances. Economists have names for things, right? And the indirect effects of industrial activity, whether they're positive or negative, are called externalities. Now, when they talk about externalities in oil and gas production, they usually talk about things like increased employment or production on one hand, or environmental damage or health risks on the other. So it's kind of like if you're getting a new job or chemo, it's the same word. But oil is internalized too, right? I mean, the oil companies, the governments have tied it securely to our personal sense of well-being. And we buy it. This idea that without oil, we'd be failures. Back in the Stone Age, living in mud huts. So they keep us wanting more, afraid of losing our power. And we don't even notice it. We only notice oil when something goes wrong, right? Like when there's a pipeline spill, or in that minute or two when we can really think about climate change. And the rest of the time, oil flows out of the ground and invisibly into every aspect of our lives. Like your iPhone, your North Face jacket, your fleece, your lipstick, your Amazon Prime delivery. You might think of this as a kind of invisible spill everywhere. Oil rippling through our bodies, racing through our blood and our dreams and desires. Now, it's my second trip to Fort McMurray, and I pulled over to the side of the road recording a little bit of field recordings. And I hear this high-pitched whine in my headphones, and I look up and I see 3 security trucks and 3 young women in uniform uniforms and work boots. They wanted to know what I was taking pictures of and why. They wanted me to tell them my name and where I was from and who I was working for. And I told them I was doing some research. They told me it was private property. I told them I thought it was a provincial highway, and they kept asking for my name until I said, look, am I in trouble here? Because if not, I'd rather just pack up and go. They said it wasn't safe for me to be there. Oh, sorry.
Days when the ducks die.
Sorry about that. I'm still working on this remote control thing. So they said it wasn't safe for me to be there, right? So it bothers me when people use safety as a rhetorical strategy for social control. So I talked to 3 guys named Dave who work in industry. I wanted to connect their sense of safety to a sense of what's really at risk. Now, Dave, number 1, is an engineer for big oil. He thinks risk is knowable. Well, I have to believe that every problem has a set of solutions. You think about risk as an unknown quantity, so it scares you. But we think risk is measurable and manageable. We can eliminate it, or we can move it to an acceptable level. There's something called a risk matrix. You can Google it. Basically, it's a grid with severity on one axis and probability on the other. And our job, basically, is to move things from the red zone into the orange and the green zones. Now, Dave, too, works on oil plant sites doing environmental testing. He thinks risk is concealed. Well, before anybody gets in, the job site is notified. We make like a tourist place for the high-placed employees. Now we go build a site and we make it so they can't get into the bad places. It's like a big stage out there. It's like a movie set. And for regulators, we just do the same thing. I mean, none of those guys want to get into chest waders and get in the middle of that shit. It's just, I don't know. Everything out there is just made up. Now, Dave 3 thinks I should question what my other 2 Daves have to say. Now, one thing I always tell people is that if you speak to anybody up here and they tell you something, even if it's me, treat me the same way. Ask yourself, why is this person telling me this? What does this person want me to believe? Now, I hope I tell the truth, and I strive really hard to tell nothing but the truth. But I mean, sometimes the truth is just told in different ways. So I read the articles about rare cancers in Fort McMurray. And when I got there, I saw how the damage isn't all on the surface. Not everybody wanted to talk about it. And not everyone agreed about what was going on. Alice says, days when we used to scoop our cup from the rivers. Dave says, well, you know what? You're going to hear a lot of, I used to be able to take my cup and dip it in the water. You never should have been drinking that water anyway, though. You should boil it. Because where does the beaver poop? Where does the fish poop? Where does the duck poop? Alice says, when the ducks died, those thousands of ducks, we had Suncor up here, and they could not even finish their presentation. It set off a panic where some mothers were using bottled water to wash their babies. Dave says, they closed the fishery in 2014. They'll tell you that's because of development, but it's really because of overharvesting. That's bullshit. It's because no one's going to buy deformed fish that are toxic. Dave says, that oil's been leaking into that river for millions and millions and millions and millions of years before this. That's why then oil-eating bacteria were developed to eat up that oil. So I ask, how can you prove how much of this oil is naturally occurring? And how much was emitted by which project at which time? And my friend Jewel tells me that each oil company has their own process, and they're all copyrighted.
They did too. It's easy to know where the contamination is coming from. There's water flows that are in the river.
It's kind of cool to hear all the voices at once, though.
Oh, no.
Tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to do everyone's voices myself, and I'm going to do away with this thing. Are you cool with that? Yeah. You heard some of their voices. I never liked media. Did I tell you that, Andrew? I never wanted the media design. So, anyway. So where were we? Right? My friend Jewel, we're talking to her, and she says that there's this, process, and they're all copyrighted. So Jewel says, they tested the river, And it's easy to tell where the contamination is coming from. Those hydrocarbon molecules in the river, they might as well have corporate logos on them. You can tell which tailings pond they come from. It's just denial, 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 denial all around. Now meanwhile, I have to go back to my phone for this. The province of Alberta released this app, and it's called Should I Eat This Fish? I'm serious. It's more fun, yeah? So I just need someone to play the game with me. Anyone? All right, great. So, get started. What kind of fish is it? Burbot, goldeye, lake trout, northern pike, sauger, or walleye?
Goldeye.
Fantastic. Good choice, sir. Where was it caught? North Saskatchewan River or South Saskatchewan River between Blind Lost Ferry and Medicine Hat?
The latter. Much more correct.
What?
The latter.
The latter? You got it. Did it weigh over 1 pound?
Yeah.
Of course it did. Oh, recommended limits for goldeye over 1 pound in South Saskatchewan River between Blind Lost Ferry and Medicine Hat. Children 4 and under, avoid. Children 5 to 11, avoid. Women ages 15 to 49, avoid. Everyone else? Men. 5 servings per week. So I wanted to answer a simple question. Is toxic processed water leaking from the tailings ponds or not? So I looked at a report from the Pembina Research Institute. It said the accumulation of more than 1 trillion liters of fluid oil sands tailing in northern Alberta is the result of 5 decades of negligence and engineering failures. Estimates for the cost of cleanup range from $24 to $44 to $100 billion. Hold it. A billion? A trillion? I can't even wrap my head around these numbers, right? So I learned a couple of strategies to relate to big numbers. So 1, take a big number and pin it to a concept you use in everyday life, like time. 1 second is 1 second. A millisecond is, anyone? 12 days, right? A billion seconds is 31 years, and a trillion seconds is, anyone?
3,100 years.
It's 31,688 years. So you take another strategy. You take big numbers and shrink them down to the level of your own life. So I read that Rex Tillerson's salary as CEO of ExxonMobil, this was before that time, for a minute when he was Secretary of State. His salary at Exxon was $100,000 a day. So that's $36.5 million a year. So let's say you are striving to make $50,000 a year, which is the reality of most of the students that I teach. Striving to make $50,000 a year. Rex makes 730 times more than they do. So your $15 bottle of wine costs Rex 2 cents. Your $1,500 a month rent costs him $2. So now that we've got that covered, let's get back to Alice. Well, in the late 70s, when Suncor had that spill under the ice, and my brother Archie and I went out to jackfish by snowmobile, and my son was there. My son Keith, the one we just lost. And my brothers and my dad were teaching him how to set a net under the ice with an auger. And we had a good catch, you know, and to us, to catch a big whitefish, there's nothing better than to split it open and cook it the traditional way. So Archie cleaned up the fish, and he made a fire. And the grease dripping from the fish was black, you know, from the oil spill. And fishing was shut down for 2 years. And Suncor got, I think, a $20,000 fine. And the fishermen never got compensated. I think it was a slap on the wrist for Suncor. You know, it really shows you who the government prefers. Now, I also talked to Big Ray Lattiser. Big Ray was a trapper and a commercial fisherman until they closed the fishery down. Now, Big Ray welcomed me into his kitchen, which is got the familiar wood-paneled walls. We sit at this table that's covered in that double layer of fabric and clear plastic. He told me that his father was a fiddler too. He's got a little bit of an accent, you know, but I'll try to do it. He says, I commercially fished all my life ever since I was a young boy. And it's sad. You got pickerel with pushed-in faces, crooked tails, humpbacks, bulged-out eyes. Same with whitefish, you know. They're starting to get deformed. The northern pike, they're deformed. And now more and more trouts in Lake Athabasca, they're coming in over here, they're sick. They got big heads on them, skinny little bodies. This was a healthy lake at one time. We're losing lots, you know. We're losing bugs in the water. We're losing minnows. There used to be seagulls, thousands and thousands of them. Some of them just totally disappeared. Those black-headed gulls, we still got those, but that other type of seagull, those little black-gray gulls, they're gone now. Totally gone. And mud hens, they call them, they're gone. And ducks. Hardly any ducks around in our area. Some of them gone. Owls. Around 2000, when industry was just really rolling, you know, at their community hall here, they have these displays of Syncrude and Suncor, and oh boy, just the whole. I went up to Syncrude and they had a banner that said 1 billion barrels of oil. And I'm there with her and I asked her, it's like the McDonald's sign, right? She says, I went up to him and I said, 1 billion barrels of oil. Well, how much water did it take to make that much oil? He says, none. And I was just like, you know what? Your nose is growing. And he just turned red. And I just walked away from him because that's the attitude. That we're dumb. That we'll just roll over and let it happen. If any of those big ponds goes and destroys everything, what are we going to do? Are we going to become refugees in our own land? Now, there's a lot of things that my family never really talks about. I never asked my mother about my stepbrother Philip's death. And this was the only time we've ever talked about it. Philip wanted to get a summer job in Fort McMurray because that's where the big money was, right? And he was an engineering student, and Fort McMurray was kind of the place to be. And my mom says, so Ernest found him a job with Vince Clark's company, and Vince Clark's company was contracted by GCOS. And what happened was they were flushing out a line, and it exploded. In other words, it just came apart. And Philip yelled out at Matt Mullen to duck, and Matt ducked, and it hit Philip. And that was the night that Princess Charles and Princess Diana got married. My mother says, well, the day we heard about it, I had been up all night watching the royal wedding. And that afternoon, the CEO of the plant called and asked to speak to Ernest and told him that Philip had died. Instant impact. And Ernest was, I'll never forget how it was sadness for all of us. And then there was an investigation. It was done by the company. And of course, it was the particular pipe. It was a plastic pipe, I think. An industrial strength. There was a fault in it, I guess. And that's what happened. I asked her if she saw a report. There might have been a report, but I didn't see one. And Ernest might have seen one, but he never told me about it. Because Ernest, you know, the emotional angst would have just stayed with him forever. So I was 11 years old when it happened. I remember the phone ringing and Ernest coming into the hall. How he just howled, Philip is dead. And then that's when his silence began. 7 weeks before I went back to Fort McMurray for the first time. A wildfire consumed the region. It was the most costly and severe natural disaster in the history of Alberta, and a hint of what could follow, right? I learned about the fire the same night that I learned my stepfather died. I watched both events unfold from a distance, on a laptop screen in a Boston hotel room. It was May 3rd, 2016. Now the footage of the fire was all over the news. They evacuated the whole city. There's only one road out of town. And I watched as bumper-to-bumper traffic moved slowly south on Highway 63. There were people driving through columns of flames, embers bouncing off the hooded cars, and voices were hushed. And nobody got hurt. I mean, people in Fort McMurray have done their safety training. And I'm in that same fancy hotel where I stay every Tuesday night for 10 years when I teach. City view, high floor, round table, angled lights. And I look down to Huntington Avenue, and I look across to the crew. I imagine the evacuation taking place there. And the news of my father's death was simple. My stepbrother Michael sent us an email with a subject line, "Father is dead." When I got back to New York, I didn't know what to do. I took one day off work. I listened to the entire opera Eugene Onegin, and I cleaned every window in my apartment. So when I was growing up, I used to think that nature could kill you, but cities were safe. Right? They were two different things, diametrically opposed. But now it's October 29th, 2012, and Hurricane Sandy turns my Brooklyn neighborhood into a disaster zone overnight. There's National Guard trucks rumbling down Van Front. IKEA becomes the FEMA response center. And the contents of people's lives are turned out in piles on the sidewalks, soaked with sewage and seawater. So what do we do after a disaster? We were hurt and we want to know why. But there's no clear place to point the finger, because the finger goes all over the place. So you say you're a survivor. You claim your victimhood. The victim is blameless. So you can go on with the work of surviving. And that's hard enough. But for a moment, we wake up to the fact that we are nature, and nature is us. Lord, have mercy on your children. Lord, have mercy on your children. So, what do you think they're going to do with 1.3 trillion liters of toxic waste? I mean, you could say you're going to put things back together, but nature doesn't work like that. Air pollution goes downwind, toxic waste seeps into the groundwater. Wetlands can't just be put together. They take tens of thousands of years to develop. The land that's being mined is called Crown land. It's public land. It's owned by the government in the Queen's name. But it's the traditional territory of Cree, Dene, and Métis people. Now, I wish I had the audio for this because you've got to hear this guy's voice, but I'm going to do my best. In the oil industry videos, they have these really nice men who say, "Can you put a little background, this is some corporate music. We absolutely, certainly believe that we'll be able to restore the land back to the original users, so they can continue to use this and enjoy this for the future, and for all future generations." That's not good. But anybody who comes from a fucked up family knows that everything's fine is like the original lie. I mean, industry says, oh, we're dealing with the toughest environmental standards in the world, but the fact is, the province of Alberta had no regulations whatsoever on tailings management until the year 2009. So industry was left to regulate itself. It's something called regulatory capture. It's a form of government failure. So over 50 years, industry has disturbed almost 1,000 square kilometers of land, and out of that, only 1 square kilometer has been reclaimed, certified, and returned to the province. So industry says, we'll have the technology, right? And we've got the best people in the world working on it. And they really do. I mean, they have people like my stepfather, and all those men whose homes we went to for dinner parties. Now last year, my mom told me that Uncle Ernest was one of the first people to design the tailings pond system. He told her it was his idea. He told her that they were just going to dump the toxic water back into the river. He told her that he thought he was doing something good. So there's an audio diary that I made the morning of July 11th, 2016. So it's about 8:15 in the morning on Tuesday, July 11th. And I'm on a gravel road. I'm still on Highway 63. I think I might be on the winter road to Fort Chip. There's no signs. There's no one around. Anyway, I had stopped by the side of the road to record some sounds. And I heard that bird that I love. It's going dee dee bitty 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 dee dee bitty 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 bitty. So I get out my shotgun mic and I've got my hand up like high in the air and I'm just homing in on the sound. And as I listen, it starts to blossom. And more birds are coming in. And at one point, it's just like this symphony, and I'm thinking, these birds are grooving. And I'm having all kinds of fantasies about myself, that, here I've learned how to listen, or that nature was revealing herself to me. And I'm having this ecstatic sort of communion with nature, right? And the mosquitoes are swarming around the microphone, and the rain isn't bothering me, and I think, this is it. And after, I went into my pocket to take my phone out, right? Because I wanted to take a picture. And it's the alarm on my iPhone. It's been going since 8 a.m. The alarm with the bird sounds. That symphony is my phone. I'm back in New York, and I've made the journey from the northern boreal forest back to the heart of capitalism. And I can see a little sliver of Wall Street from one window of my apartment. And I go to Ohio for a music conference. And afterwards, I take this road trip to Michigan because I was looking for people whose lives were connected to Alberta oil through pipelines and rail lines. And the Koch brothers, they stored piles of Alberta pet coke in Detroit. Enbridge Line 5 carries Alberta crude right through Lake Superior. And of course, there's the Koch Auditorium at Lincoln Center. But anyway, that's how I met Frank Adamkashik. Frank's the executive director of the United Tribes of Michigan and the governing board chair of the United League of Indigenous Nations. And Frank told me, when our ancestors reserved our fishing rights through the treaties, they didn't say that those are our fish. They reserved the right to fish, which meant they reserved the right to pray for the fish, to dance for the fish, to sing for the fish, to catch and eat the fish, to live with the fish, to have a relationship with the fish. That's what they were reserving. So we don't think of it as property, but as having a relationship to the natural world. Frank told me that the real treaty right is that relationship. And he thinks that it's that connection that we need to protect. So for years, when people asked me where I was from, I didn't have an easy answer. And it wasn't just because Fort McMurray wasn't on the map. It was also because I was ashamed. I wanted to sound cosmopolitan, so I'd say I was from Calgary. Or when I realized there was a sort of a capital in having an extreme childhood, I might play it up. Maybe I'd tell you that Fort McMurray was the suicide capital of Canada, or that they only built the road up there 2 years before I was born. It really doesn't matter. If you look at my passport, you see place of birth, Fort McMurray, and date of birth, 1970. And if you know those two facts, you know a good chunk of the story of my life. And for years, I told myself that to pursue a life as a musician was to choose to sacrifice a part of my past. So I didn't look back. But all this time, I've carried with me an invisible atlas of Alberta. The texture of trees, the tone of the sky, The angle of light at dusk driving north. The rough, rapid fires of my uncle's voices. My granny's hands rolling dough for pierogies. And I thought I had to give those things up. But now they're all in the atlas. And that bird I was recording, that's in there too. It's a white-throated sparrow. And get this, they're born in the boreal forest of northern Canada. And like me, they migrate to the east coast of the United States. And then they go back. And now so do I. And the Red River Jig, that's in there too. Because a good fiddler is not the best fiddler. A good fiddler is the one who moves your feet, who remembers enough of the tune to play it, who can tune their fiddle, who cares enough to keep playing. And the nice thing about a tune really is that once you know it, you can play it anytime you want. You don't even have to remember the tune, right? You just have to remember that it's still there. Biodiversity for a livable climate, and I'm just going through my representatives from each organization. And my first prompt to you was how you heard the themes of the missions of your organizations in the content of this piece, if you did. And also, you can introduce yourselves.
Sure. My name is Sabine Kamiri. I'm a member of 350 Massachusetts, which is one of 3 projects that the Better Future Project is involved, and the other 2 are Divest Ed and CREW, which one is about fossil fuel divestment at universities, and CREW is about building resilience in local communities. Before I respond, I just want to say I love it. It was really powerful, and it will go through my head for, it's hard to respond immediately for me, and usually it takes me some time to sort of digest the stories, but I think for us here in Massachusetts, obviously the Tar Sands are very far away, but we basically began our work in 350 Massachusetts with the KXL protests with the Keystone XL pipeline. And I remember standing outside in the freezing cold in Wayland with like 10 people, and we kept trying to find ways in the snow to move so that we would get warmer. And then we got a really nasty comment in the newspaper about how how, you know, we obviously all drove there to the protest, and therefore it was completely ridiculous that we were requesting that the Keystone XL pipeline not be built. But I heard you talk about the oils sort of being everywhere, and I think that is really something that is, as a climate activist, is our work, is our job, is to make people understand that this is not a distant thing, that it's not an invisible thing, it's right here. I mean, you know, someone said to me yesterday, well, yes, many people will suffer under climate change, but it won't affect me. And I said, it is already affecting you in so many ways, but people are not aware. And I think your performance, combining the music, I think music is extremely powerful in alerting us to these things.
What about me? My name is Adam Sachs. I'm the director of Biodiversity for Livable Climate. And since this is a story night, I'll tell Biofilclimate's origin story.
Yes, that's wonderful.
So it started with 4 climate activists, or 3 climate activists, and 1 restoration ecologist who stayed in there. Who was also concerned about climate, but not primarily. And we were sitting around the kitchen table, and this is an emergency. What are we going to do? So we said, hey, why don't we start a nonprofit? So we started a nonprofit. And that was in July of 2013. And come January of 2014, we had a meeting with lots of other people. And we said, now what? Somebody said, hey, why don't we hold a conference? And we all thought that was a great idea, and that led to our first conference in November 2014. And we had no idea what we were getting into. None of us knew how to throw a conference. But we actually pulled the pieces together, and it was called Restoring Ecosystems to Reverse Global Warming. I'm not so sure that the reverse applies as much as we thought it did back then. But the conference was a presentation of people from around the world who were actually taking these desertified areas and turning them back into full, blooming, life, enthusiastic ecosystems. And people came into the conference. Our audience was climate activists and some scientists and a number of farmers and ranchers and the general public. And it was a pretty doomy gloomy conference at the beginning, because all of this was, we have to do this ending of use of fossil fuels, but it wasn't going so well. And over the weekend, people heard other folks who were just managing the land and the water in such a way that it was a transformation. And they came to us after the conference, and several of the people who were there are working with us now, still, and said, my God, why didn't somebody tell us that we can do this? And so that's what we've been doing for the past 5 years. We've had 12 conferences since 2014, and have our videos up on YouTube, and an audience of 140,000 people around the world that watch them. And it's a tough slog, I gotta tell you. Yeah, as I'm sure you know. And I really love tonight's performance. My attention didn't flag for a moment. And there were pieces of living things in there. And as you said, we are nature. us. How do we pull that together for a large general audience? And how do we incorporate the urgency that has been becoming so increasingly apparent over the past just 2 years, over the past 1 year? This is the acceleration on the exponential curve. So I think it's great that you're telling this story, and hope we get a chance to chat about it.
I would love to just take a moment and ask if anyone here has a question or an observation that they'd like to share, or a way that the themes of this piece connected with your own stories or your own lives. Yes.
Well, I'm a PhD economist.
Oh, hey.
So,
Did I get it right?
yes. I mean, I was really struck by what you said. I mean, the whole notion of externality is always my bullshit detector would go off, because fairly early on I realized that everything is interdependent, and there's nothing external about it. And your emphasis on connection, and everything's connected, and the oil is everywhere in us, I thought was really good. And I have wrestled with these questions of how economic value is calculated all my career, because we're leaving out all the important stuff. And how you transform that into something that is more sensible and consistent with the interdependence of everything is a problem that I don't have a solution to, but it's certainly one that I think is right at the center of my thought.
It's probably gratuitous to say this, but Fred is not a normal economist.
Not normal in any way.
But a great fisherman.
Anybody? Yes.
I just wanted to share an observation that we've been really lucky here in Massachusetts to have some contact over the last few years with people from fracking communities in Pennsylvania, and how important that's been to building the movement. Relatively less contact with the community you brought to us. And so I'm really, really grateful for your ability to bring this other story of something that's the other end of a different pipeline, and how important that is.
Thanks. I mean, I think for me, like one of the real motivators behind doing this piece was the degree to which I had erected an invisible barrier within my own life, right, where I literally did not see oil development, right, and most of the people I lived in Alberta, like once I moved back here after Juilliard, from like 1992 until 2004. So I've spent up until age 34, all but 4 years of my life in Alberta, and did not see it. And then it was another 11 years after that moment on the panel discussion where it really clicked in that we were talking about oil. So I often like to, I teach a lot, and so I like to pronounce things on stage. That's what I do. But one of the things I always tell people is that if you want to change the world, a really good place to start is with yourself. Because the stories that we tell ourselves shape how we see the world. They filter our biases, our prejudices, what we see, what we don't see. Sheldon, who I met through doing the work on his play, now you guys know him too. Everybody, hey Sheldon, he's somehow here with us. He told me that there is a concept of healing circles in the Cree society he's from, which sounds a lot like, I don't know, it sounds very psychodynamic to me, but it starts with you at the center, and then your family around you, and then your community, and then tribe, and then nation, and then the world, right? So this notion that the healing has to begin from that central place. And I also think that this is like, I don't know, this does not sound like a popular message in terms of climate action, but this is what I think, is that by relieving shame, I think the shame and blame are the biggest preventers of value, biggest preventers of progress, right? Feelings of should, or I'm not, or this isn't right, or whatever. So I think by examining those things, that we can make an enormous, it frees up that capacity to have a relationship with nature, if you can have a relationship with yourself. Does that make any sense?
Yes.
Sorry.
So have you forgiven the oil companies?
Oh, Lord. I really, 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 really wrestle with this. I did a reading of this piece on Monday, a week ago Monday in New York, and in the audience was a person who is in part, became a little bit of a character in the piece, who is an engineer for Big Oil, who's an old friend of mine. And it really changed the tenor of my experience of doing the reading, knowing that there was someone in the room who had an expert knowledge of the industry from a very pro-industry perspective. I don't know if you guys get these ads here, but WNYC and some of the podcasts and sponsors have started running ads from Exxon.
Yes.
Talking about carbon capture.
Yeah.
Does that really like freak you out?
Yes.
I know, I love Invisibilia, and now I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Why?
All of
Must
them,
you?
yeah.
Right.
if you've gone to their, so I listened to one on the daily,
Yeah.
and then I went and traced it back to the source and read their like white paper that they were promoting. It was quite scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So where I struggle with what I'm saying is when I did the reading and my friend was in the audience, I could feel how easy it is for me to do this reading for an audience like this, and how hard it is to do it in accountability, in full accountability to all of the citizens of the place where I come from. And so literally, I think what I'm trying to do is not so much that I've forgiven oil, but what I'm trying to do is with performance, I always think of performance as being like this irreducible truth-making and truth-seeking mechanism, like you cannot fake it. Like I stood up here or I didn't, I said things or I didn't, I played the fiddle or I didn't, right? And so I think about the ritual act of doing this performance as being my ongoing, developing reckoning with myself, with my hometown, with my family, with my story. So I don't think it's like forgive and it's done. You know? I think it needs to be enacted again and again and again. Again, like if I look at somebody else, like I could feel how my friend felt shamed in that audience. In a very white, very affluent, downtown Brooklyn audience. I could see how he felt. And that was not at all what was being projected in that room. Was not, a room that we would all be very friendly with. It's not anything that felt acceptable to me. Now that's, on the other hand, it's like I have a short life and I gotta pick a side. So when it comes right down to it, he tells me that he actually thinks that climate change isn't really real and sea level, as an engineer, he does so much drilling and he kind of, this doesn't get out. he sees too much, in geology. He's no geologist, but he sees enough of it to know that sea levels are constantly in flux. And that was a really uncomfortable truth to hold on to. To know that my friend believed that, and yet I still wished for his well-being. But you think love is big enough? I think the other way, I don't know if I'm saying this right, but I think hating is not going to move anything forward. No, I'm really tired now.
Great. I'd just like to really go a little further on this aspect, because since you have such a connection with Alberta and with the people there, I'm just wondering to what extent, given the horror of what you've described, that the people within it must be becoming aware of it. Is there any sign of people from within turning against it in the style of whistleblowers, like the people who turned against the CIA from it being working at? Are there some people from within who come out and denounce it? Or is there, even at any level, that could organize? And because they might have a particular impact coming from within and seeing it at its most extreme.
Is there anyone here from Alberta?
I'm from Alberta.
Hey.
Hi. So I grew up in Calgary, and so
did she.
Yeah. so the project started in 1967.
Yeah.
1964. So as a kid, I would find out about it, and you just assumed that, oh, here's this new technology. It sounds really cool, and you just assumed that this was a good thing, and that we were proud that it was going to be developed and brought to market and this kind of stuff. And so I just think about this ongoing assumption that we have that oil has been our forte, and here, now we're aware of the consequences.
Yeah, I mean, Ernest Manning, when he dedicated the opening of the plant, dedicated it to the free and creative men and women of the province of Alberta so that they may realize their dreams.
So the attraction and romance of this technology is kind of like the attraction and romance of the audio technology, and your iPhone that chirps for you, but doesn't do what it's told.
Yeah. I mean, I would, to answer the question that you posed around whistleblowers, I have spent the last, 14 years outside of Alberta, and my research for this project would be my first trips back in a long time. I can't claim to speak for everything that's happening there, but I could say that in the people that I've spoken with in the course of this work, I've spoken to a lot of people from Alberta. There still maintains a general kind of aporia around these subjects, and people don't talk about it openly because everyone's so tied to it. And it's not just a question of like, this is important, it's not just a question of losing a job. It's a question of where your kids go to school. It's a question of your kids' friends. It goes that deep, right? So oil companies do this, like engineers' lives are like uprooted all the time. It's a condition of working for oil as an engineer that you will be moved around. It's like being in the military. And so there is a level of family suffering, but when you talk about people at lower ends of the employment spectrum, there's a lot that ties people to place. So the whistleblowing, I would say I haven't heard a lot of that, but I have heard a lot of really, really complex points of view from people working on the inside. There's a lot of ambiguity, there's a lot more dissent, there's a lot more complexity of perspective than you think. There's an organization called Iron and Earth in Canada. They have one office in Newfoundland and another one in Edmonton. And it's an NGO that's made up of former oil patch workers who are working for environmental ends. And that would be like one place where I would like direct that question right there. I would love to hear what they have to say about this. But I mean, even just the existence of that NGO tells you something. Yeah.
I'm just sharing that there's a chapter in a book called Are We Screwed? About the millennial generation and whether they are aware of it. And there's one whole chapter about young people who grew up in Alberta who are fleeing to find jobs in other industries and in other places in the world because they don't want to be part of it.
Can I just say one thing, which is that, like, when I started doing, sorry, I want to just be able to see you better. When I started doing my research for this book, I was, where I'm also writing a book about this, the play, I was astonished by how, and this is going to sound bad, but I found myself, my hackles were raised by details that people got wrong, by ways that people overemphasized one aspect of the story and not the other. And I do think that more generally we're living in a time where we have sort of lost faith with the gatekeepers of knowledge. Like more generally, we are kind of living in a post-truth era. And so what I noticed was that, like, for me, like the radical commitment to my own truth and to be able to tell it from the stage and put it on the page mattered. I haven't heard that same story in Alberta about people fleeing the province.
This is just younger people in the generation who don't want to go into the business.
No, I understand that there's people who don't want to go into the business, but I haven't heard, I follow the Alberta media really closely. I listen to CBC every day, all day, and it's interesting that, like, there may be people looking to do other things. And I know that there's a tremendous interest in jobs in renewable energy and clean energy, and there's a lot of training going on at Northern Alberta Institute of Technology. They have, like, really, like, high-level vanguard retraining programs. But I think more than anything, though, that do you know there's an election going on there this week? There's like a super conservative, like an ultra conservative party that's like gonna. Anyway, it's tricky. It's not that different from here.
Thank you. I have a practical question for Sabina and Adam. So apparently, and my sister and brother have inherited a minuscule interest in Oklahoma mineral rights. And every month I get requests, somebody wants to buy it. So what can I do besides ignore them? How can I mobilize the other 100 people who own the rights to actually prevent it from ever being fracked?
I can answer that. I'm living in Colorado, and the same kind of thing is going on in Colorado. And the state and the oil companies they get the mineral rights. It doesn't make any difference what you say. No community has any say about the mineral rights, even if they own them. They would like to have you give them over or sell it to them, because then they have a toehold, and they have what they call forced pooling. And so when they drill down, the oil companies, and then they do horizontal drilling, which is fracking, and they can frack for about 2 miles, actually, underneath the ground, and they say that it's underneath the aquifers and underneath the water lines and the groundwater and so on, but who really knows what they're doing? And they're pumping chemicals in there to crack the rock so that the gas can come out, what they call the natural gas. But your mineral rights, the people that own the mineral rights in Colorado anyway, and I'm pretty sure it's probably the same, is because they want to get somebody, so then they get a toehold, and then they can just do it to everybody around you. It doesn't matter. But I would say hold out, but I know people need money, and farmers, are going, out of business, and they need the money. And this can put their child through college or something, the initial couple $1,000s that they would pay you for the mineral rights. But you only get paid for production, for when it produces. When it stops producing, then the money stops coming as well. So it's a big dilemma for a lot of people who own the mineral rights. But I think it's in Colorado now, and somebody answered that question that man just said there, people are starting to wake up. They've elected a legislature now that is now putting out the setbacks and getting people organized, and it's changing a little bit. But it's going to take a long time because all of the politicians are paid by oil and gas. Every single one. They're just, you can't get elected unless you take oil and gas.
I don't think that answers your question, but one really cool story that I saw the other day in the movie is that a guy who had land that industry wanted, and there was also the danger that it would be taken through eminent domain, and he declared it a work of art and copyrighted it.
That's what I was just looking up the details for that.
Yeah, because then once it's copyrighted, it cannot be changed. And I think it's in the movie about the DuPont,
There's a few little things like that do work, but
I'm just looking
and
for
then you can't, no matter what,
I'm looking for the name of the Alberta sculptor whose name I cannot remember right now, who owns a large patch of land that is prime pipeline territory, and he's dotted it with sculptures which are trademarked as works of art. And so now what he does, and he's been doing this very silent but very that's not silent protest, it's a visible protest. But now charges oil companies $500 an hour to come and meet with them. So there's also an artist who's doing a similar project in the Hudson River Valley, upstate New York, by tagging trees with blue paint. This becomes copyrighted as a work of art. So, the one thing that I would say that we do have at our disposal, any of us, is an enormous range of choices in creativity and imagination, right? Yes.
I
I wanted to thank you for letting us go visit with Alice up north and her dog and share with us what's going on up there. And I thought that was very, very special. I've spent a lot of time in Cape Breton because the ancestors up there they all played the fiddle. They didn't play the violin. And you kind of helped me think about how the fiddle is really about connecting with people. You know, whereas the violin might be some other place. But a lot of when we go up there, there's big music festivals in Cape Breton every year, and a lot of the people have to work in Alberta, but they always write songs about coming home. Cape Breton, the Fisher Gun. Now, one of the things from my connection with bioclimate, the whole idea is there is enough potential in nature to restore this whole thing. If people want to be part of that process, that's great. It's going to happen. Maybe after civilization or whatever. But what I've learned in the last 10 years is that the resilience of the system, that our kids, you know, who teach them about, the resilience of that system is much bigger than I thought it was 4 or 5 years ago. And we can restore this planet, and we can be, humans as part of that, we can become a restorative species. But we may choose another choice. But at some point, those birds are going to come back, and those fish are going to come back, with or without us. And that's powerful. And we need songs about that. So, thank you for that.
Nancy Langston, I think has
What's that?
Nancy Langston has written about that.
Sure. Yeah.
The power of nature. Who was first?
Yeah.
You first?
Yeah, thank you so much. My name's Ari, and I do communications work with a nonprofit called Corporate Accountability, based here in Boston. Among other things, we challenge the power of the fossil fuel industry. And I mentioned both of those things because as I was sitting here absorbing your powerful piece, I can't help but do so through the lens of communications and narrative, as well as the lens of corporate power. And so I have 2 questions that are kind of related to each of those facets, and you can choose to answer both or whatever feels right. But one is the concept of regulatory capture that you mentioned is, you know, it's really widespread, and it sounds especially powerful in Alberta. And I'm curious to hear you talk just a little bit more about what that looks like and the ways that industry has captured government there, as well as, and you touched on this a little bit, but I think we tend to think of regulatory capture or corporate capture of government or society as being sort of narrowly focused around policy, but you alluded to a little bit all the ways that industry has sort of absorbed people's lives and made them feel like the only story that is possible is the story that the industry tells. So that's one question, and then the other is a moment of your performance that really stuck in my brain was when you were talking about the different labels that people place on Fort McMurray. Yeah. And the sort of jibe at Leonardo DiCaprio parachuting in and calling it Mordor. And I'm curious from your perspective, having grown up there, the mainstream environmental movement and climate movement has been, I think, rightfully criticized for the failure to really describe the interconnectedness of all things that we were talking about, and making climate for so long just about climate and this abstract concept or even the environment. And I'm curious, just from your upbringing, your perspective, if you have ways that you can recommend of breaking that down better, how you'd like to see that narrative shifting.
Okay, so the first question was about a little bit more about regulatory capture and the mechanisms by which that happens. So I think one way is like that culture, the petro culture of Alberta, like the Derrick Golf and Country Club, the American Oilers, you know, there really is a pump jack in the playground at McDonald's I used to go to. We don't notice those things because they're normal, right? So, you know, the kids, you know, you go to the Sunboard, whatever, the Syncrude, the other oil companies send home like toys for the kids with logos and brands on them that effectively create a culture of normative oil production. There somebody who's like under the age of 28 about this, who's told me that they never received any critical education around energy economies in Alberta. So they got the public school curricula, you know. You go to university, it's very clear from the names of the oil companies, the donors on all the buildings and structures where oil interests are. And it's one of those things that, like, I don't know, I heard from people after the 2016 election how when they went home for Thanksgiving, like depending on where they're from, there's some conversations they just couldn't have. So there's those kinds of silences in the culture more generally. As far as my stepbrother, Michael, he's still alive, is a very passionate environmentalist. He was a powerful role model for me. He runs 2 environmental product stores in Edmonton that sell, you know, like soaps and foods and all kinds of things. And he does all the business for his store on a bicycle. He also doesn't invest because he believes that there's no such thing as gaining a profit that doesn't involve the destruction of human life. So, you know, he's like really hardcore, and I would say that he would be seen by the most part as aberrant, as kind of a fool, but I think that he made a very powerful culture and community around himself. It was the long game, and I think there's a necessity for all different kinds of actors in that. I mean, I see the friction around like the Greenpeace activists and how the Greenpeace organizers handle their actions in Alberta and why they need to set up this absolutely oppositional narrative with zero sort of like complexity and cross-reference because they need to raise that counter-narrative so strongly. But there is a need for all of the other kinds of narrative. Does that make sense? So multiple kinds of narratives and like always trying to meet people at their level. And I think for me, it was really that process of reckoning. Like, there's a lot of stuff that got stripped out of the play, but there are a lot of communications that I had with people where I had to negotiate a form of accord with them by proving to them that I understood that, as one respondent told me, that oil runs through your blood. That is something that I could hear those people on the panel discussion with me at the beginning, that very first monologue, I couldn't hear any of them ever admitting that they lived lives that are steeped in oil. And if they did, they would say it in such a way as like, oh, isn't it disgusting, isn't it overwhelming? A different quality? I don't know, I mean, it took me like 46 years to start to do it, so. I forget what your other question was.
I think that was great.
Yeah.
Ari's question and your answer answers my question. I did have a question about, here are 2 things, right? So that this has to be understood, and then the solution you can sort of do is now. But these are communities. Just answer the question about the conversation.
Right.
But I'm wondering out loud, can you franchise, can you model those and franchise them for other things? I mean, I've lived a life, I'm probably heard your piece tonight, but I grew up on a farm in Monsanto and Pioneer are everywhere. When I was born, there were maybe 400 varieties of corn, and now we're in the thousands of varieties of corn. And on our farms, we farm right across Indian burial grounds. We find arrowheads every year and so forth. And there's a parallel here, and I see the same blindness, to the dead children along the drainage ditches for all the cancers, right? That people talk about, that we don't talk about. So if you figure out a way to get your community mobilized, or awake and mobilized, then maybe there's a way to franchise that and bring it to other communities that are suffering in other ways.
I would say that labor issues and labor organization more generally is a really powerful mechanism for disrupting corporate control of corporate narratives. And I see it in my jobs at both schools that I work at, where there are really powerful barriers to organizing faculty and how we move increasingly to like part-time unsecured faculty jobs where I don't feel I can speak up because I'm afraid to lose my job and thus lose my health insurance. What I need badly is for the people who are in secure positions in the schools that I teach at to stand up for me, right? Sorry, it's looking red. But that's what I need. I need the people who aren't living on the economic edge like I do to be able to stand up and say that, no, this matters, and to see how these much deeper structures of neoliberalism play out in every aspect of our life. So, you know, I think that's that's like the way that I feel like I can get up in the morning. I mean, other than getting up and like going immediately out for a run, because otherwise I'll just like get crippled with anxiety. But the way that I feel that I can handle, the way that I'll do it is like by telling myself a story about reaffirming always the areas in which I have choice and where I have control. Because otherwise, I think there is actually like, there's probably a pretty evil interest in cultivating a culture of fear and a culture of like hopelessness. So I don't know, that's why like I play the fiddle. I never wanted to play the fiddle. I was trying to get away from that. You know, I wanted to be a Juilliard and be fancy. But I see how very powerful it is like to own a song, to make a sound that is yours alone and that you can make anytime. Can I tell you one little story and then we should probably wrap up? I was standing on 13th Street in New York yesterday and I was texting you and I heard somebody walking down the street singing this beautiful, buoyant melody. And I was like, just made me smile that some man was walking down the street singing like that. And I turned around and I smiled at him and I said, hi. And he smiles and he says, hi. And I'm like, wow, he's a really nice guy. And we're just smiling at each other and he says, Tanya. And I'm like, who are you? And he was a student that I had in class here at NEC in Boston 8 years ago. And it's a bigger story about like, how do we build lives, resilient lives, as being able to keep our voices heard. You know, he went through a really dark time, he worked some crappy retail jobs, and now just like shout out Wayne Arthur Paul singing at the Met this fall. Wow. Just saying, right? But like it's that fidelity to the voice that was so beautifully enacted there. Had he not let his breath move through his vocal cords and let that song come out, I wouldn't have turned around, I would have been deprived of that chance to connect with somebody who reaffirmed for me the idea that the choices I make matter. Does that make sense? And I think we all have choices like that we can make, and the things that are devalued in us. My stepfather might be an accountant. It wouldn't be so bad. I think it would be a really beautiful accountant. Cast in line Monday. But, that this stuff matters. I feel like we should leave it there.
Can you tell us your plans for the show?
Oh, my plans for the show. I need $50,000 in funding. Please, anyone. I'm about, more or less, to start to travel this along the routes that Alberta Oil takes into the world. So my plan is to perform this. I mean, it'd be great to do it in performing arts centers and theaters, but I'm actually more interested in doing it in classrooms, community halls, back rooms of bars, living rooms, and literally to take me and piano player and just go along the routes, along the rail lines, along the pipeline routes, to go to St. John in Brunswick where they load the tankers. And if I can get on a tanker ship, I will do that. I'll do the piece there. We'll go to like India and China where they sell their pet coke as cheap fuel. Just on and on. I could probably see myself doing this for the rest of my life, but in order to feasibly start it, I would need some form of capital. I designed the piece in such a way that I could do it on my own anytime. But I think it'll have more impact if it has a little bit of infrastructure and staff. I mean, doing this work when I'm teaching 6 classes a semester and cluing into the fact that I didn't start saving for retirement until 4 years ago, and that means I don't have enough, which means I have to keep working. Like that, putting those pieces together and then also making a choice to keep open a space to do this work. One of the problems I think of doing artistic work or pure activist work is that it crowds your senses. And it crowds out the kinds of considerations that if you didn't happen to come from a family of means or family of privilege, where, you know, those structures are in place for you. I mean, I really honestly thought that music was going to provide everything for me. And now I realize that it didn't. So but that sounds really sad. I'm sorry.
No.
But like a brutal, like
project. It's a big project. Bring it to the world.
a basic reality is that will cost like, you know, $5,000 to $7,000. You know, at market rate, $5,000 to $7,000 a week to do well. There's a way to do it for no money, but if I do it for no money, then it comes at a cost. So there's probably a way to do it for $1,200. There's ways and ways and ways of doing it, but there's also a book. I'm working on a book-length mixed genre memoir, historical research, nonfiction book version of this, and all of this was meant to. I do have a PhD in ethnomusicology, and I do technically have a scholarly position in the New School in New York, where I'm expected to produce stuff. So this doing the performance was an active disruption in the economy of academic knowledge and its forms of production dissemination. I was trying to see if I could take the research methodologies. I have some master's degree in theoretical psychology. To use that knowledge about history of science, critical theory, ethnography, and fiddle playing, and stuff from my grandmother, and stick it all together in such a form that it would actually reach people, rather than going into a digital journal that would be read only by other nervous specialists in the same field who are definitely trying to help us for 10 track job.
I'm so glad.
Yeah. So anyway, you know what would be really awesome is that I didn't put out an email list sign-up form, but if you would like to know more about the project, can I put my my notebook up here, and you could leave me your email address,
Yeah.
and I'll let you know the next steps.
Yeah.
Hey, Tom,
Yeah.
how can we donate to your?
Oh, that's a really good question. I didn't set that up yet. Actually, I'll get fiscal sponsorship through Fractured Atlas, and then I didn't think that far.
If we sign up for your email list, will you let us know?
I will, absolutely. Yeah. So what I'll do is, I've been, so far I've been doing these sort of developmental readings where I work out the knots and the bits, and we had some technological failure tonight that was good to know about. And when the pieces sort of workshopped and developed enough, I do have a presenting partner, producer On Guard Arts in New York, who's interested in working with me. Ann Hamburger, who's the CEO of On Guard Arts, was the leading light of site-specific, issue-oriented documentary theater in New York from the 80s on, and has a really stellar track record. So she would be kind of my institutional, organizational partner in the United States for producing this. I've also just applied to some, major sources of funding, like the NAP fund and things like that. And then my next flip over is to also do the same thing in Canada and try to secure some larger funding there. So yeah.